So what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk with you guys a little bit. If you could just tell me a little bit about maybe a scenario or two about the kinds of things that you're seeing that makes us ask that kind of a question. Anybody brave? Yeah, go ahead.
Just disagreement within the organization. So I manage a lot of IT projects that are enterprise-wide and involve all of the departments.
Mm-hmm.
Only the development group is interested in doing Agile in sprints. The outlying groups that we report to, they're used to Waterfall methodology.
Yeah.
The date and having that date stick.
Yeah.
And no adjustment in anything along the way.
Yep.
And then as the PM, we don't have any authority to make any kind
Yeah, you can't go make anybody change their process. Yeah.
PMO is not even settled on the Agile methodology, but it comes from some of the C-levels on the IT side.
What's making me smile is, isn't it great being a project manager? I mean, it's just awesome.
As usual, between the rock and the hard place.
Yeah, so basically just for the sake of the video, what you're saying is that the IT folks, the development folks want to use Agile, but everybody around them is really kind of stuck in a waterfall world, and the PMO doesn't have any ability to enforce or maybe even necessarily influence.
That's true, but we do have to manage the IT work of the project in sprints and Agile.
Yeah.
And somehow report on the rest as though it was Waterfall.
Gotcha.
Still make it all fall in on time.
Yeah, gotcha. Totally with you. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
What I've seen and being kind of new to the Agile methodology is some business teams that already have adopted Agile, and they need to engage an IT team. And
So the business teams are doing Agile and the IT teams are the ones that are doing Waterfall?
well, not necessarily, they're not necessarily doing Waterfall, but you bump into needing to go through an IT process that's not necessarily Agile, like stage gate process, you know, approvals and all that.
Yeah,
stuff,
got it.
you know, before you actually get to the project.
Yeah.
You know, so that's what I've seen.
Okay. Awesome. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so we have a project that's really comprehensive infrastructure delivery plus application, software, right? And then we have a customer who is in the waterfall line. That's how they want to see milestones.
Okay. So that's an interesting twist. So you're able to do Agile, but the customer, your external customer, wants to see a more waterfall type project plan?
Right, it wants your project plan, it wants the milestones.
Yeah.
And then within the delivery team, one team, application team deliver the Agile sprint
Okay.
method, and then you have another team.
So even within the same organization, there's still,
Different BUs.
yeah,
Different BUs have different methodology.
yeah.
So that was, yes, very, very exciting.
Okay, awesome. Maybe one more. Yes, sir.
Emphasis on speed of delivery of projects.
Okay.
Have a team that wants to finish a project faster than the team that's working on the waterfall side.
Yeah.
So there's conflicts in regards to that.
Okay. Okay, cool. So let's talk a little bit. So what does Agile mean to you guys? Like why are we trying to do Agile? What's the goal? To deliver value faster. I'll take that one. Anybody else?
Change quickly.
To adopt change quickly.
Don't have a plan.
Okay. Anybody else? What is that? Minimize risk. Fascinating. It's awesome working in a room full of project managers. Yes.
Business models are changing more faster.
What is that?
Business models are changing more faster.
Yeah.
So we adapt to that.
Okay, so let's figure out how to start kind of tackling this problem. So let's see if we can get a few things kind of like set, because I'm kind of winging it here with you guys a little bit, because I want to explore this and make it pretty meaningful for you. So when we're trying to do a waterfall project, what is it that we're fundamentally trying to do? We're trying to predict the future, right? I would agree with that. We're trying to maybe understand all of the scope before we get started, so that we can start to put together time and cost estimates and put together a schedule, right? And I think as mature project managers, we'd probably recognize that just because we put together a plan doesn't necessarily mean that we're always going to be on plan, right? As project managers, our job is to manage conformance to plan, right? And so if the organization is underperforming or ahead of schedule, schedule variance, cost variance, that kind of a thing, we have mechanisms to make sure that the organization is prepared to deal with it. Now in reality, right, that's not always the case. It's like we're kind of like, you know, trying to do fixed time, fixed costs, fixed scope projects, right? Okay? But so what I would suggest is that what a waterfall project is fundamentally trying to do is it's trying to minimize risk by increasing certainty around scope and through planning, right? And then being able to figure out how to manage if there's any deviation to that. Is that kind of fair? Yeah, okay, cool. Well, so if you think about it, what waterfall is kind of assuming is that the solution is known, who's going to do it is known, the amount of effort it's going to take to do it is known, and then it's fundamentally a sequencing problem, and then managing variation, right, as kind of the real world kind of hits it. Right? Fair enough? Okay. You don't agree? No, what's your thought?
In software delivery, a lot of times the customer don't know what they want.
Well, but here's the thing, right? So the question, the comment for everybody else was that in software delivery, sometimes the customers don't know what they want. Well, but waterfall assumes that that is a knowable thing. I know the reality of it, right? That's why Agile exists, right? The reality of it is we don't always know what we want. But is it safe to assume if we're going to go through a traditional SDLC, right, analysis, design, build, test, deploy, right, there's a requirements gathering step at the beginning that is kind of demanding us to make decisions early. Fair? Okay? So waterfall is trying to mitigate risk by pulling decision-making forward and trying to lock in kind of that complexity into a known situation that you can actually plan for. Okay? So what Agile's fundamentally trying to do is it's trying, I'm trying to think how to say this, but it's like, it's trying to mitigate the risk that we're building the wrong thing. Okay? Now this is probably a gross oversimplification. So I've got some project management people that like listen to me on my blog and stuff like this. So I don't want to like, I'm not trying to get into super nuanced stuff. But in general, what Waterfall's doing is saying, okay, tell me the scope and let us figure out how to derive time and cost. And what Agile's doing is it's saying, look, we don't know quite what to build. So what we're going to do is we're going to fix time and cost, and we're going to plan on much smaller increments. And then we're going to measure how much of that we're able to produce on regular intervals. Fair? Okay. So the challenge becomes, is if you think about it, the goals of both of those systems are different. Okay? And so the question, I think, how this gets answered is not so much how do you get Agile and Waterfall to work together. I think practically it's how do we have a discussion organizationally about how to get our shared understanding of risk and uncertainty and how we're going to manage that risk and uncertainty brought into alignment. Okay? Now, as I'm going to get super pragmatic here as we go, and we'll talk about some techniques for kind of meeting in the middle. But the challenge becomes is what are we willing to assume about what is known and what is knowable? And is it a good use of our time to go try to figure out those unknowns before we start? There's the gentleman, and I wish I could remember his name now. It has to have been 7 or 8 years ago. I was working at version 1, and I was getting ready to come out and do a talk. And I was explaining Agile from my understanding of it at that time, 7, 8 years ago. And he says it's irresponsible if you start a project not knowing the scope of the project. That was a really fascinating perspective, right? So if you believe it's irresponsible to start the project without knowing, right, then you might take one different task, right? The other side of it is, if we just know we don't know, then we have to have some language for how to deal with that. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So it's been a long time since I've had my nose in a PMBOK, I'm going to be honest with you. Had my PMP, but I think I got my PMP and back in the PMBOK 3 days. Are we on, I know we were, oh, okay, cool. I thought we were at 5. I was wondering if maybe like one snuck in before. Do they still talk at the beginning of the PMBOK about rolling wave planning and progressive elaboration? Yes. Yeah, okay, cool. So sometimes I think both sides of the argument have room to have a conversation, but we don't always recognize that there's room to have a conversation, okay? And so when I hear things like rolling wave planning and progressive elaboration, what I'm hearing is that we know more about what's going to happen in the near term than what's going to happen long term, right? So there's nothing inherent in project management that is like dictating a strict waterfall kind of governance cycle. I'm not saying that sometimes we don't do that in companies, right? We don't mandate that based on the decision-making processes and the funding processes. But I would suggest that project management allows for the idea of breaking things into phases, okay? And then detailing out those phases as we get deeper into the project. Fair? Okay. Now let's talk about Agile. Let's see if Agile's flexible at all with this. So let's do a quick, you guys were like talking about certifications. Raise your hand for me if you've heard of Scrum. Okay, I'm figuring you guys are in. Okay, cool. Extreme programming. Okay, we're gonna go through some oldies because anybody ever heard of DSDM? Okay, I knew I'd stump some of you guys in the room. Feature-driven development. Okay, cool. So we're getting kind of old school with some of those things, right? But more, let's go a little bit modern. Who's like working with or heard of SAFe? Okay, cool. Large scale Scrum or less? Okay, cool. Let's think what else. Kanban, right? Kanban. Okay. Lean startup, right? Okay, so what's interesting is that all of those different methodologies are actually all considered agile to some form or fashion, right? Even rational unified process, and I'm going to get my agile card taken away for saying this, but even rational unified process can demonstrate agility if you're delivering in increments and iterations, right? So agility in my book is not so much about are you using Scrum or extreme programming or SAFe or less or whatever. What agility is the ability to respond to change when you learn new information. Okay? And so that's what all of these methodologies are doing in some form or fashion. So I would suggest that things like RUP and DSDM and feature-driven development are what I would consider the heavier side of Agile methodologies. They're a little bit more planful than maybe we would like in our Agile ecosystem, right? But there's mechanisms there for that. I would suggest that like scaled Agile framework is more planful than Scrum or XP or some of the other things, right? So you can almost imagine a continuum, right? So you've got DSDM and RUP and some of the heavier things, and then maybe SAFe lightens it up a little bit, right? It talks about planning PI to PI, but it doesn't really talk about planning more past that, right? You might say large-scale Scrum's a little bit less heavy than SAFe, but it still has some prescription in it. Maybe then there's Scrum and XP and different things like that. But on the other extreme, is anybody ever paying any attention to Twitter, like the hashtag no estimates? Is anybody familiar with that? So there's a lot of people out there that really believe that all estimating and planning is fundamentally waste and that we shouldn't do it. Now, again, right, that's an oversimplification of their point of view, but there's a lot of people that believe in extremely lightweight approaches to doing things, okay? Sometimes when you're doing Scrum, anybody worked on a Scrum team that basically just plans sprint to sprint? Right, they get their backlog like right before they walk in the room, right? Anybody worked in a team where they maybe had 3 or 4 sprints of backlog or a release worth of backlog? Okay. Yeah, right? So there's nothing really in Scrum that says how far the product owner can plan their backlog forward. Okay? And so then you get into like over in like Lean Startup world, where Lean Startup is an agile way of working that's basically built upon experimentation. So what Lean Startup is fundamentally coming along and saying is that, look, we're new, right? We're trying to invent a market. we're trying to figure out what customers will buy. We don't know exactly what it is that we're going to build. Okay? And so if I don't know exactly what I'm going to build, or I don't know what the market will buy, then how can I build a backlog to do it? Right? How can I plan? I mean, and then like the other extreme would be is if I'm doing waterfall that's heavily predicated upon knowing everything, or at least knowing what's coming up in the next phase, and I've partnered that with like ultra lightweight, figure it out as you go, experimentation, sense and respond kind of agile, right? They become very incongruent. Okay? So what we have to, like, I think the first kind of idea I wanted to drop on you guys is if we're going to talk about how Agile and Waterfall work together, the question is are we being dogmatic about our Waterfall, and are we being dogmatic about our Agile? Because if Agile's only like one little tiny thing, right? I walk in and I'm doing Scrum or Lean Startup or whatever, right? And this is what Agile is, right? Then it's going to make it really hard to have a conversation with our Waterfall counterparts. If we're dealing with like strict, heavy governance, phase gates, can't do anything rolling wave, can't do anything progressive elaboration, everything has to be known up front, but yet, you know, so it's like, do we have the ability to negotiate with our Waterfall teams? Does that make sense? Yeah, so a lot of like what I've been working on for my own personal kind of research and edification, but also what I would say in market, kind of like what we do as a company, is helping people understand what they're trying to achieve by adopting Agile or adopting Waterfall. Because what you inherently are going to find is that the heavier and less flexible the Waterfall guys are, then I need to be a little bit, well, and sometimes even a lot more planful and intentional about my Agile. Okay? If my Agile guys are super inflexible and will only do it a certain way, well then the Waterfall guys are going to have to give. And what it ends up happening is that most of the time, what we really need is kind of like a pragmatic mix of the two. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. What I wanted, the reason why I didn't bring slides and I wanted just to write up here a little bit is because I want to see where you guys were in the room in terms of how to start to begin to shape this conversation. And so we've been noodling around on this idea for a couple years of this thing we call Four Quadrants. And it's awesome. And this is like something you guys could literally take back and like run with your teams. Okay? And what started happening is a couple years ago, and a lot of this was when I was working at version 1, I was kind of like singing the Agile song and I was telling the Agile story. And we would go into clients that had purchased their software and kind of like some of what you guys were saying, the messages of Agile wouldn't resonate. Okay? And I started really thinking about it. It's like, well, I'm like selling goodness here, right? I'm telling people the good news, right? It's like, I need to, you know, why don't they get it? And so I started writing about this about a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago now, maybe 5 years ago now. And I started thinking that there were some companies that are built for predictability and other companies that are built for change, adaptability, right? So most organizations that probably we support as PMI members they have PMOs, they have governance, they have annual planning cycles, they're trying to reduce risk and uncertainty through heavier discovery and heavier planning and heavier governance and heavier regulation. Fair? Okay? So no value judgment, it's just kind of what it is. So we want to acknowledge whether an organization is built for predictability or whether it's built for adaptability. Okay? And then on the vertical axis, I started thinking about markets and customers and things like that. And I kind of coined this, it's not great language, but it's about the best I could come up with. I call it emergent or convergent. Okay? The reason why I picked those two words is if you think about a company like Google or Facebook or Amazon, right? A lot of these companies that are really doing like real-time stuff on the web, and they can put things out and get feedback and A/B tests and all those kinds of things. Like Google, what's fascinating about Google is it doesn't matter what Google builds as long as it sells advertising, right? They collect your data, they monetize it, they sell you advertising. That is what they do, right? The fact that they have Android in your handset, Right? They don't build Android. Well, they do build Android, but it's like that's not their product. Their product is the ability to collect your data and send you ads. Right? So they can build anything they want with whatever features you guys are willing to use as long as it collects your data. And so I call that being emergent. We are able to inspect and adapt and figure out what it is we want to do. Okay? On the other side is this idea of convergent. And this is where I think about tax software, sometimes ERP systems, compliance problems, things where the feature set is incredibly well known, or at least should be able to be understood. We're not trying to figure out a market, we're trying to conform to a set of known, understandable requirements. Now, there may very well be some uncertainty, right? Maybe we don't know perfectly, maybe the customers can't decide exactly what they want, but the problem space is largely knowable, okay? So this is like not knowable and probably don't even want to know it. Like we wouldn't want to like, I mean, could you imagine if Steve Jobs had like sat down and like cast 10 years of the iPhone out? Right? I mean, that's not what they did, right? They put something in market, experienced how customers are using it, and then every year released the whatever it was that they wanted to do in order to be able to, make that a great product. Versus stuff on the other side that is legitimately like an RFP. There's a very specific thing. That's what they want. Okay? And so, kind of by doing this exploration, we talked about this idea of predictive emergent, predictive convergent, adaptive convergent, and adaptive emergent. Okay? And what's powerful about this is when I first kind of discovered it, I started talking about predictive convergent as is like the traditional organization, the plan-driven organization, right? We're striving for predictability. We have a notional idea of what we want to build versus the agile world, which was all about change and all about kind of inventing the product. Okay? And what was kind of like the first key insight in that is I said, if we're over here selling agile to a company that values predictability and fixed stuff, right? There's an impedance mismatch in the language, right? And so when we started thinking about it, we kind of realized that this is somewhat the chaotic, yeah, close enough. It's kind of the chaotic quadrant, right? Because I'm built for predictability, but things are changing around me all the time. Does anybody feel like they're living in that kind of a world? Yeah, maybe one or two of you. Yeah, okay, nobody's like saying anything, but eyes are getting wide and everything. Yeah, cool. So what I would typically do is that the world of kind of traditional project management lives in this quadrant, but what we've kind of discovered is that you can do agile in that quadrant too. It's different than maybe the agile that you read about. It's different than like if you've worked in a small startup or something like that. But you can do agile on mainframe systems down here, right? You can, but it's different, right? It's not Scrum per se, right? It's just different, right? And then this is where, in my opinion, agile's home base is, which is I'm built for change, but I'm still trying to make and meet commitments. And so what's fascinating about it is what Agile is, and this is like a really like strong kind of, I think, misunderstanding about Agile, is Agile's incredibly structured and it's incredibly disciplined when it's done well. What Agile does is it breaks work up into smaller batch sizes and delivers more frequently so we can get feedback. And what it does is it creates more opportunities to change direction if we learn something new. Doesn't necessarily make it easy to change. It doesn't make it awesome. It doesn't make our business stakeholders necessarily love us, right? But if I'm doing waterfall, analysis, design, build, test, deploy, and I find something late in testing that causes me to re-architect the entire system and go back to the beginning, we all know that's an incredibly expensive change, right? But if I design my systems and I design my work so that I'm releasing more frequently, right, getting to kind of a definition of done at the end of every sprint or release, I may or may not decide to change direction, but I've created an ecosystem where I have the opportunity to change direction. And that's a really subtle point. Just because you're doing Agile doesn't mean you have to change all the time. It means you can change when you need to. Easier and less expensively, right? So as you move down this quadrant, right, what you start to realize is that batch size is everything. So something like safe is basically over here where batch size is, the PI. Probably don't plan a whole lot more forward than that. Scrum might be doing every sprint planning, or it might be batching up releases. It might be batching up 3 or 4 sprints, right? But there's a lot of different places where you could map out the different mainstream Agile methodologies. Lean Startup kind of lives here because you have an organization that's built for change and your market is shifting around all the time, okay? So I'll put Lean Startup up here. And this is why I think this is a key conversation for a talk on how do you blend Agile and Waterfall. If the people you're talking to about Agile have a belief system that is in the upper right quadrant, like nothing is knowable, we have to be able to change on a dime all the time, right? And we're going to not plan anything forward. We're going to do just-in-time, continuous discovery of features and requirements based on customer feedback. That's probably a really tough conversation to have with somebody who's squarely in this quadrant, living in a strict waterfall world. Okay? So the answer fundamentally to the question, I believe, goes something like this, is if we poll the organization, and this is the exercise that you guys can actually do, and I actually do this with executive teams sometimes, and it's kind of fun, is you lay out this model and you ask them, which quadrant are you in? And can you imagine that often those guys disagree with each other? Right? And so sometimes I'll joke, I'll be like, imagine you're a project manager or a team member or doing whatever, and you're trying to help change, do an Agile transformation, or you're trying to introduce methodology or whatever, and the organization is not of one mind about the nature of the problem it's trying to solve. Now, a lot of times you'll get into this weird thing of where are we now versus where do we need to be. We're in the business of Agile transformation, so we are quite often dealing with companies that are in this upper left quadrant that desperately need to be in the upper right quadrant because they're getting their market eaten in lunch, or their lunch eaten in market, but they've got constraints, technology constraints, people constraints, business process constraints that absolutely have them locked down in here. Okay? So to me, what I might do is I might try to facilitate a conversation in the organization and go to the waterfall teams and go, well, help me understand your assumptions about what we're trying to achieve. Because if they are legitimately in this quadrant, right, and they need to stay in this quadrant, or they can't move out of this quadrant, then Agilists up in this quadrant are going to have a really hard time working with them. Now let's talk about some legitimate reasons to be in this lower left quadrant, right? Because we're not going to paint these lower left quadrant guys as the bad guys. So think about, Atlanta's a big financial services. Anybody work in financial services here? Anybody write software either in or on top of a mainframe backend? Anybody write software on top of something that transacts billions of transactions a day and has to be right to the penny every single time, right? Those aren't the kinds of systems where you're like figuring out as you go, right? There's governance and control and liability and stuff like that. Anybody familiar with Gartner's like dual mode IT thing, bimodal, right? What bimodal is fundamentally coming along and saying, it's not Agile versus Waterfall, old versus new. What bimodal is coming along and saying is that there are certain parts of your system that are systems of record. When they change, they need to be changed incredibly intentionally and very systematically, because failure in that quadrant or in that kind of mode is absolutely unacceptable. Now, not only is it difficult to change these things, but a lot of times because they're built on 40, 50-year-old technology, they just can't change that fast. And there's no amount of doing Scrum on top of a 50-year-old legacy mainframe that's going to make it particularly more agile. Okay? So that's just your world, right? So if I've got a Gartner Mode 2, which would be like a system of innovation, and this is like the classic problem we see. 50-year-old mainframe banking system on the back end, and we want to do mobile innovation on the front side, or web innovation, or something like that. And that's all fine and good until the mobile guys or they're operating in internet speed, deploying weekly, doing all this cool stuff. And then they say, they get the wise idea, well, in order to be able to do this market competitive feature, I need to introduce a change into the back end. right? And then they might encounter a 9 to 12 month, 18 month even, like lead time in order to where they can get that. So the conversation that I have quite often with folks is, if you're using Agile or Waterfall down in this quadrant, and you have a piece of the system that is operating up here in this quadrant, right? As a business, we have some choices. I can either say, I'm only going to build on top of APIs that exist, or I'm going to build on top of maybe their near-term roadmap, right? Things they're already planning to do into release. Okay, but if I inject a dependency down here into this back end, then I am going to go as fast as the back end goes. Does that make sense?
Mike, would you put insurance industry in that as well?
Yeah, anything like the interesting thing about insurance, sometimes it's medical, companies. It could be, banks are in this situation. Like anything that was like an early adopter of technology in the 70s and 80s that is built like fragile legacy kinds of systems on the back end, or there's large systems of record and data stores and things like that that can't be wrong ever. Okay, those are the kinds of industries where you see this kind of a challenge. Okay, so again, you see like the richness of how you have to answer this question. Okay, because you have to kind of start with where everybody's belief systems are, where the constraints are in the system and what's actually holding them back. And then you've got to figure out how to negotiate the rules of engagement between the different pieces of the organization. Okay? So, like on one extreme, you could say, okay, well, we're going to bring everybody to what I would call the lowest common agility denominator, right? So one way we could flip the conversation, and we can go deeper into this depending on how we're doing on time, but one way to kind of flip the conversation would be, okay, if these guys are going to do waterfall or even like heavyweight agile, and I need to sync a project plan with a group that could very well be in this upper right quadrant, right? They could be innovative and figuring it out as they go and all that kind of stuff. What kind of constraints am I willing to impose upon these guys to get them to come around to this side of things a little bit? Okay? Because these guys, candidly, for the most part, are never going to be up here. Okay? So that is like, to me, is like the core challenge. Or what we can say is it possible to decouple the pieces and let these guys move as fast as they want, but the rule being is that they don't get to inject dependencies into this back end. Okay? Because candidly, these guys don't always know when stuff's going to come out of the back end of the system. Right? Yeah, well, so here's the interesting thing, right? The journey through these quadrants is you could do one of two things. So if I've got pieces of the system that are down, or the system that's down here, I can build pieces side by side here. I can take that mainframe and I can do like a services-oriented kind of cloud solution, but I've got to take these pieces and I've got to refactor them, and I've got to put them into those new containers, and I got to move them to the cloud. And then I've got to change my governance, and I got to change how they're controlled, and I got to put, whatever it is I need to put around them. Okay? So that is what we're doing with a lot of banks right now. It's like we'll say, okay, what pieces do you want to live here? And we'll leave them here, and we'll do like a really heavyweight kind of. And when I say heavyweight agile, you could still do Scrum, but what it comes down to is that when you're down in this quadrant and you're trying to do agile, what you're doing is probably that progressive elaboration rolling wave stuff that I was talking about. So I can do agile, I can do team-based, I can do Scrum. Chances are I'm not shipping to production every day. Chances are I'm not deploying the code into even test every day. But hopefully I can deploy it every 2 to 4 weeks. Okay, maybe more frequently as we get better at it. I'm probably doing 9 to 12 month roadmaps. I'm probably creating 3 to 6 month release plans. I'm probably building heavy 3-month detailed backlogs, minimum 3 to 4 sprints in advance. This quadrant, I'm focusing on stabilizing velocity against a known backlog, getting things to as close a definition of done as I possibly can, right? I'm doing Scrum, but I'm not as agile as I want to be because, for one, I'm planning pretty far forward, but I'm also encumbered with dependencies in the organization, right? And that's going to limit my ability to be agile. But I can plan with agility. I can do Scrum. I might be able to do SAFe or something like that, but I'm doing really explicit dependency management. I'm really dealing with a lot of forward cross-cutting concerns and all those kinds of things. Okay? And so a lot of times when we walk into an organization that's in the process of making this transformation, this doesn't feel super agile, right? Even some of my coaching team, it's not super rewarding to them. It's necessary if we're going to start moving towards agility, but it doesn't feel great. And the reason why it doesn't feel great is because of all of that legacy stuff and that legacy organization that's up underneath it. Okay? So like the first step of like a waterfall team becoming more agile is that they might organize around complete cross-functional teams. They might do Scrum, right? But they're probably going to have some planning group on top of them that's like doing all of that forward backlog grooming and dependency management and dealing with cross-cutting concerns. And their agility is not local to them, right? The agility comes from how the system is planning around them. Okay? So they're still doing a lot of forward planning. They're still doing milestones. They're still dealing with cross-cutting concerns. They're still managing dependencies. But they're not doing like analysis, design, build, test, deploy, right? And so this has to be designed for most organizations. Okay, but it's a way of getting a heavy waterfall organization and moving them a step forward without actually totally disrupting all of the governance and planning and milestones. Okay? And if you think about it, right, so this is a total aside, so I'm going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, so I'm warning you, okay? So, okay, let's just get a quick poll. Who here like works in software? Okay, who's non-software? Okay, interesting. Okay, what do you guys, just out of curiosity, what do you do that's non-software?
IT infrastructure.
IT infrastructure, okay, cool. So, okay, I got my head around that one. Anybody else? Business operations. Anybody else? Any other non? Yeah?
Robotics.
Okay, interesting. Okay, cool. So, again, right, I'm dusting off my PMP knowledge here, right? It's been a long time. But when we learned about how to create a work breakdown structure, okay, what was like the lowest leaf of a work breakdown structure called? Do you guys remember? Work package. Yeah, okay, cool. What is a work package supposed to be? It's a what? Well, hang tight, okay? Don't jump there. It's a what? It's an estimate, but it's like there's something about it that makes it meaningful to your customer. It's like a deliverable, right? But it's more so than it being a deliverable, it's something of tangible value that actually demonstrates progress. It's something that they're willing to pay for. Bill, is it? So Bill made the comment that in Agile, it's kind of like a user story or a feature. Okay? Now, I got this when I tell stories like this, I can't name names with clients, but there was a client I was working here in Atlanta about 7 years ago, and I was looking at the project manager's project plan, and I want to say, I'm probably going to get it wrong, but it's like 650 lines in this Gantt chart. And then like one line was build the software, and it was 6 weeks in duration. The other 600 or so lines were like, build this document, go to this meeting, do this thing. We are guilty as sin in the project management community, especially the software project community, of putting activities and intermediate artifacts in our work plans. Okay? That's what's killing us, right? I could Gantt chart out an entire Agile project down in this quadrant, but my first level breakdown structure might be, and again, I'm probably getting the words wrong, might be my epics. And then my next level in the work breakdown structure would be my features. And the next level in my work date breakdown structure would be my user stories. And my next level down might be the activities. Okay, I might even have a higher level that's like thematic elements or big major milestones or something like that, right? We have to stop thinking about, as project managers, planning activity, the things we're going to do, and we have to start tracking towards the things that we're going to produce. Okay? So part of our inability to effectively manage sometimes in this quadrant is self-inflicted based on kind of our mental model around how we plan our work. We plan activities often rather than work packages. Okay? I think it's because that word work, right? What's work, right? This is stuff we're going to do, right? Going to meetings, that's work, right? Writing a document, that's work. A work package is something that produces value to the customer, right? So it's interesting, right? It's an interesting way of working at it. So I can do Agile in this quadrant, and I can do it in a kind of a more of a plan-driven way by, in effect, thinking about my Gantt chart in terms of work packages, epics, features, user stories, right? And sequencing the work of the teams is like the unit of progress, right? The team is like the functional work unit, right? Not individuals in Agile, right? It's the team, right? So just with a few mental shifts and how I'm thinking about it, I can do a relatively decent plan-driven kind of Agile project. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not. In some companies, that is the absolute starting place where you get going. Okay? So the first question I might ask is I might say, is it possible to get my waterfall organization to do something that's agile, or I might say iterative and incremental, rolling wave planning, progressive elaboration, down in this quadrant, right? That might be one of my first negotiating points. The second thing I might do is I might say, okay, I know you guys are all lean startup-y up here, right? And you're figuring out as you go. But maybe they have to come down here a little bit and be a little bit more thoughtful in advance about what it is that they're trying to build. Okay? What questions do you guys have? What are you guys thinking about?
Trying to think how to put
Oh.
that together in the infrastructure side.
Ah, okay, cool.
When I'm researching a lot of this stuff, it gears more towards software development.
Mm-hmm. It does, right? And I think what's harder about it is that, so it might be a good time to like explore some examples here, okay? And I'll share with you my thoughts on things, right? And I don't know if these are going to be like perfect answers or anything, but I'll at least share with you kind of how I would approach thinking about it. So what's fascinating about infrastructure, and again, I don't know where you guys are at, but with the whole advent of DevOps and basically infrastructure as software and everything being dynamically configurable, we're starting to see infrastructure operate a whole lot more like software at the end of the day, right? So like I'll go back to like 10 years, God, is it 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, where we're like doing like major ERP upgrades, where the hardware is getting upgraded as the software is getting upgraded, or we're building software to ride on infrastructure that doesn't exist, right? So if you think about it, right? So the hardware kind of has a life cycle in and of itself, and the software has a life cycle in and of itself, okay? We can't like, there's a tension here, right? We can't basically say, well, we can't start building software until we have every single thing in place at the end, but we also don't know every single attribute of the hardware until we know the software, right? So nobody has perfect knowledge of the system walking into it. So what there has to be to some way is ability to create like a feedback loop between those two different parts of the plan, okay? So like I'm just telling you some things that like we would try. Like I might try like, maybe I'd think like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. During phase 1, we've done this stuff, right? We've worked with like borrowed hardware or hardware that we had, right? And we start iteratively developing the product on top of it. Right? Then we get to a milestone point and we go, okay, what did we learn about the performance characteristics? Probably by this time, I need to have had like the critical architectural elements done, probably need to have run it through my performance and scalability lab. I probably have needed to run it through security, right, to test like all the core pieces of it. And then I go, okay, guys, this is what we've learned. Do we have enough to place the order? And now probably out here, I've got like a hard date that says if I don't get the order in, we won't be able to go live in time. Right? And then you say, okay, well, maybe we need to change this configuration. We do something else here. We continue to iterate, right? We give it a feedback loop. Okay? And then we continue to iterate, and we get to the point where we go, okay, we got to build hardware. We got to buy it, right? Or else it's not going to be here on time. Okay? So what I like is it's almost like the idea of like build a prototype, you know, tweak or enhance the prototype, and then once we have enough information, go ahead and place the order. Right? So you can do things like that, right? If you're able to think like in a, now again, right, DevOps and things makes this a lot easier a conversation to have. But we would, again, right, back in the day, loaner hardware, temporary hardware, beg borrow hardware, and then once we got a pretty good idea of how it was going to perform, we could actually place the order.
So when you get the hardware first, it starts to depreciate as soon as you get it.
Yeah. There's this thing that came out of the financial industry that a friend of mine taught me. He calls it real options. And so real options is like a thing for managing risk in financial portfolios, but we also talks about it in terms of software. The challenge with a lot of us, I think, is that you know, there is economic advantage, to your point, of deferring decisions until we know the most possible about what it is that we're doing. And so as human beings, we often want to have everything locked in early so we can make the decision and get off our plate. And one of the things that this little thing that this guy said, he goes, most people would rather be wrong than be uncertain, right? They would rather have absolute certainty about their plan rather than to understand where their key decision points are and keep this decision open for 3 or 4 months. I don't have to order the hardware until here. Nothing's saying that I have to order it here. So sometimes, again, it's like negotiating with your waterfall partners to go, okay, what do you need to know and when in order to be able to effectively manage your part of the supply chain, right? Then once I understand what they need to know and what they need when, then I can design my work to validate all of those decisions that have to be made early. Another thing that we're guilty of on the software side is a lot of times we want to do the easy stuff first and save the hard stuff till later, right? What do we say? Well, let's just get some quick wins. Let's start getting some traction. Let the team form, right? Well, all of that time that we're getting the quick wins, there might be big, heavy architectural concerns or performance concerns that are lingering that we didn't validate. Okay, so that's kind of another way of thinking about the waterfall, Agile hybrid. If I can get the waterfall guys to tell me what is the key information that they have to know to do their analysis, design, evaluation, whatever it is they're doing, right? Well, then I need to sequence my Agile work to make sure that they have the information that they need, which often means I need to front load the risk and to do the hardest, most architecturally significant things that are going to drive these decisions. And I use that information to sequence my backlog and to front load it so I'm making decisions early enough to where these guys have what they need, right? And so what will happen is that we know that these guys, for all their planning, they do not have perfect knowledge of what's going to happen, okay? So they're going to be going about their merry way, doing their thing, right? We're going to be going about our merry way, doing our thing. Right? Performance lab is late, didn't get the software built in time, had some defects we didn't anticipate. It's going to happen, right? But then we create these communication loops between the two plans, and we let this guy's plan inform this. If something changes here, we let it inform the backlog, right? So with the right level of communication between, right, you can create kind of negotiations between the two different tracks of work and get them to line up a little bit. Any thoughts? You guys buying what I'm selling at this point?
Is it something similar to just-in-time architecture?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit, right? You could think about it, right? So to me, like, it's really about, like, a good friend of mine, a client of ours now, we used to talk about the idea of, like, guardrails and mile markers, okay? So, like, a guardrail on an interstate where you got a certain latitude, you can only go so far left, you can only go so far right. You know, every time you hit a mile marker, you kind of know how far you need to be. Right, so what we want to do is we want to understand, we'll use like the waterfall plan to kind of create some guardrails and some mile markers. Right, so I'm going to let this evolve. And here's kind of another thing about Agilists that the Agile community needs to mature up a little bit, I think sometimes, is just because we're delivering iterative and incrementally doesn't mean that we don't have goals and constraints up here. It doesn't mean that we don't have deadlines and things that we have to be able to get in the market with. The challenge is that we recognize that we don't know everything necessary to get there. So we're going to inspect and adapt and adjust, but I'm constantly looking up to my plan and going, how am I tracking the plan? What's the smallest thing that I can do to hit the plan? What's the easiest thing that I can do to make sure they get what they need, right? I mean, we can't operate these two things as if they were not the same thing just because these people say they're waterfall and these people say they're agile. Right, so even if I were doing like super lightweight lean startup here, be like, okay, I still have to kind of know where these waterfall guys need me to be at a certain time, and I have to design my experiments to try to optimize my chances of getting there. Okay, so again, it's not like a prescriptive kind of a thing. It just requires a lot of communication and coordination across.
Prescribed end date?
Yeah, so let's talk about end dates, right?
Right, I mean, it's all very iterative, but I took my epics, features, et cetera, but here's the end date, and
Yeah.
I only have so much budget. I've got to meet that end date.
You do.
I have to
Yep.
figure out my minimum viable product.
Yep.
There's just no way around it.
Yeah, no-
How much I plan around it.
No doubt, no doubt. But here's the question you ask is like, do you always hit your dates?
Of course not.
Well, we know there's some uncertainty, right? So I've sat in rooms full of people and I go, we're like doing all this planning. I go, you have 10 times more work to do than you can do by the end of the day, by the time the time runs out. And I go, what do you guys want to do first? And they go, doesn't matter what we do first, we have to do it all. And I go, but you just told me you have 10 times more to do than you can do in the day. And you're right. And so we get in this funny conversation where they go, they know it's impossible to do everything in the amount of time they have, but yet they have to do it in the amount of time they have. So what they're really telling me is that in the presence of good data, it is politically unsafe to say that the date's bad. Okay? That's a different class of problem. That's not a methodology problem. That's an organizational culture problem. Right? They would rather you say, yep, green, 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 green. Oh, crap, it's red. We're going to be 3 months late, right? Right? But that's a different problem than a project management problem. Right? So let me answer your question more directly, okay? So you guys have seen this diagram before, right? So I kind of alluded to it earlier. I think this is actually a DSDM diagram. So scope, time, cost, scope. The way that traditional kind of project management tends to start is, tell me the scope, let me derive time and cost. I know it's an oversimplification, but that's generally the approach. And then what Agile's saying is time and cost and vary scope. Okay? Well, when you say vary scope to product people, they kind of have that same reaction. Well, what do you mean vary scope? Everything's equally as important and everything has to be in the release by the time that we get done, right? Fair enough? Okay, cool. So this is where you start to deal with constraints. And so if we're operating in a constrained system, what we have to do is we have to be mature about how we decompose and sequence the work. And if we're operating in a constrained system, we don't know for sure that we can get everything done on time. I don't care how fine-grained the backlog is. I don't care how many hour estimates you have, how great the person was that did the estimating. You don't know. You might know within a certain variation or a certain band if you're really good, but you don't know. So the challenge that I'll issue to people, it's like, in the presence of uncertainty, you don't know the exact scope, you don't know the exact amount of effort, you don't know the exact amount of time it's going to take Bob to deliver that code because he might get sick or his wife might be leaving him or kids might get injured or whatever. Right? All kinds of horrible things can happen to Bob. So we have no idea, literally, when this is going to happen. Okay? So when you're dealing with time and cost constraints and you've got milestones, and let's say it's something like a trade show where we have to be there in September with a demoable product, or we are going to miss our entire sales cycle for 2018, right? Really, really hard mission critical dates. So you guys are all familiar enough with this stuff. So what we do is we talk about an epic, decomposing down into features, decomposing down into user stories, right? Right? User stories decompose ultimately down into tasks, right? So we have, in effect, a work breakdown structure of our deliverable. It is up to us as project managers, and this is where Agile's a little different, and if we structure the work this way, it works. We have to focus on, you mentioned the idea of minimally marketable feature or minimally viable product. The discipline all the time is if I am trying, and I'm choosing my words really carefully here, if I am trying to optimize my chances of hitting these milestones, and I'm trying to optimize my chances of being in market with a product, a viable product at that time, the discipline that I have to bring to bear is to break these things up into really small, well-understood chunks and always focus on doing the smallest thing possible. And that's a risk mitigation technique that most people don't realize. Doing the smallest thing possible always, all the time, optimizes our chances of being in market on time.
But now I'm back to, am I breaking all that stuff down day one, or when I reach my third milestone and I'm staring, you know, in 30 days
It's a judgment call. It's a judgment call. So here's the thing. So 30 days out, absolutely, I would have a day-by-day script about what I was going to be able to build. I might be wrong on any given day, but I would script it out for 30 days. Generally, when I'm having this conversation with people, I need, and this, again, this is going to be some agile heresy here, but I need a 9 to 12 month epic roadmap with rough orders of magnitude estimates on the epics. I probably want a 3 to 6 month feature plan with a pretty good idea of like what we think is going to be in it and what their relative priorities are. And then I'm going to do a 3 month rolling backlog, and I'm going to just be as structured and disciplined as I can be. And I'm going to do everything in my power to get my teams to establish a stable velocity against this known backlog. Because if I know the size of my backlog and I know the velocity of the team, I can start to anticipate duration, right? That's kind of how this works, okay? Now, it gets dicey if this is indeed not knowable, okay? But then you're in kind of this funny thing, right? I have to be in market with a product in a month and I have no idea what to build. So get to building something, right? Well, then how do you know if you're, yeah, it just gets, at that point you're dealing with like 3 guys in a garage just building something just to try to get the best thing they can out, right? So we're assuming a certain degree of kind of maturity and organizational structure and some knowability here. Right? If that's not the case, if you're legitimately operating in this kind of construct and you really don't know what to build, then what the company's done is they've made a really bad investment. They've put critical dollars on a critical event and don't know their market strategy.
I think they know what to build.
Yeah.
I think they have that concept. Very fluid, but they understand what the end goal is, and there's this artificial date.
Yeah. Well, so okay, so you remember, so you're old enough to remember probably when the first Star Wars. No, well, I'm 46, right? So I got no. So first Star Wars came out when I was like 7, right? George Lucas released it. Yeah. Okay. Cool. A few years older, right? And then what is like when my kids were born, he re-released all of them, but he had added like a lot of things to them. You guys remember? I don't know if you guys remember, but in the VHS version of this is so obscure, but okay, the VHS version, they had like interviews with him at the beginning, and he said something that has stuck with me to this day. He goes, "Great movies are never finished; they're only abandoned." Right? And what he was saying is that he had to release on a certain date. There were things that he wanted that he wasn't technically able or couldn't, or just for whatever reason didn't make the cut into the final movie. Okay? So the discipline of delivering on time is always doing, that's why we, in Agile, we talk about keeping things potentially shippable all the time, right? Always having it in a known state. Always doing the smallest thing possible. Because when you're dealing, so this is the reality of our situation. We are dealing with a fixed time. We only have so much money to spend. And I'll tell you, even in the short run, you can throw hundreds of millions of dollars at projects and add tons of people to it. And we know, right? It's like, was it Brooks' Law or something? It's just not going to go any faster. It'll actually make it go slower. So over long periods of time, we can grow organizations and throw bodies at things. But in short periods of time, 3, 6, 9 months, that is not a productive strategy for going fast. So for all intents and purposes, our date is fixed and our cost is fixed. So we know that the only thing to vary is scope, right? Triple constraints. Right? That's why I like talking to project managers. You guys believe in the triple constraints. Now, if scope is the only thing that's variable, but we know we still have to have a viable product and market, right? The scope management strategy has to be do the smallest, most valuable thing all the time. And if we have enough time, our estimation has been good, we'll get through everything and more. If our estimation hasn't been good, if we hit unknowns, then we will at least have what will hopefully be a minimally viable product on the backside. That feels just like brutal reality to me, right? okay? So now here's the thing, right? Getting back to the original premise of our conversation. If I'm dealing with a waterfall team, right, that waterfall team has to be in market at the same time as you guys, but they've chosen to do analysis, design, build, test, deploy. Their project plan says they're going to get there by here, right? Then it's our job to work side by side with them as the Agile team. We're operating within their milestone constraints and making trade-off decisions to get as close as we possibly can by the time that milestone lines up.
A lot of friction there.
It's a lot of friction, yep.
Pull out some user stories to meet the date, even though you're already trying to train people to operate against that system. Lots of friction.
It's reality, right?
Smiling face.
It's reality, right? It's just reality. One of the best comments, I don't know if this will be totally applicable, but I was working with a product owner who's in Israel, and we were doing like these crazy 4 in the morning conference calls here in the US, and I was teaching this concept, right? So a product person has 2 choices that they can optimize on all the time. They can go through for breadth of functionality, or they can go through depth. Right? The deeper and more rich they want it, and the more bells and whistles and the more perfect things, then the risk that they're taking is that they're not going to get through as many of them. Right? The more they're able to thin out here, the greater their chances they're going to get their big ticket items, but they might not be as robust. Right? So what the product people have to be doing in Agile all the time is constantly balancing how deep versus how wide, and would you rather get through 3 or 4 and have them be fully fleshed out? Or would you rather optimize for getting 8 or 9 and recognizing that they might be a little bit more rudimentary? Okay, these are just trade-off decisions that grown-up product managers have to make about their products.
That decision was made to go a mile wide and an inch deep, and the product was not there. So.
But that's on the product owner, right? Then they overcommitted to market. You know, again, right, there's just some pragmatic realities, and I'm much nicer when I'm consulting, but it's like when you're sitting in front of a room full of people, like the physics of this stuff don't change, right? We all buy into the triple constraints, right? You can fix 2, you got to float the 3rd. Well, if we're in market on a certain date and we have to have this, so all it becomes is scope management strategy, right, at that point. And I get they want a pony, right? I want a pony. Give me a pony, right? I demand a pony. Well, you don't get a pony, right? We ran out of money. So would you rather me show up to the trade show with something that is at least reasonably close to working? Or would you rather me show up with something that's like just analysis and design docs? Or would you rather me show up with something that like nothing works? Or half of it works? Or, you know what I mean, right? These are all just trade-offs, right? Because as much as we would like to say that we can have everything exactly when we want it, right? There's trade-offs that we have to make. How am I doing on time, by the way? Got 5 minutes? All right. Not that I'm happy not to be talking, but like I'm like kind of like in a good place.
So real quick,
yeah.
You had a matrix and you said usually companies fall somewhere in there.
Yeah.
And then you moved to, well, within the company, you've got Waterfall out here, you've got some Agile folks here.
Yeah.
Are you recommending in some instances that people have more than one flavor of Agile?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
2 flavors?
Well, it just depends on what you need, right? I mean, again, like, you know, we'll work with like large holding companies, which are basically like, you know, 25 totally different companies within the same umbrella. And some of them are incredibly lean startup and they're early stage, and then there's some that are incredibly mature on top of legacy product lines. Absolutely. I think that's part of what's getting us in trouble too, is we want to have like one methodology that fits all, or we want to have 2 or 3 that we get to choose from in the PMO process. Yeah, that's like a whole different line of conversation. But yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. I believe you've got to tailor the methodology to the problem at hand. And that's the reason why we tend to draw that quadrant, right? Predictive emergent, predictive convergent, adaptive convergent, adaptive emergent. Because just getting on the same page about how we're going to approach the problem, right? And then you've got to deal with the constraints that are operating within the system. Right? I mean, if you think about it, right, the PMBOK doesn't tell us take every single thing in this document and apply it all the time. Right? It gives us a palette of choices. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll take it as a PMO and we'll say, okay, well, these are the 3 configuration choices that you want to lock into. But if we're all expert project managers, theoretically, you're able to take anything within that process framework and choose to apply it situationally. Right? Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that. What other thoughts, questions? Because I think we're actually in Q&A mode, right? We actually have a few more minutes, but it's just like we're supposed to be done with the talk part of it.
So what about organizations that are hooked on the date and that's it, and everything's priority one?
Yeah, man. So I will tell you, right? So this is the thing. So I'm an agile guy. You know, I like to think of myself as a pretty smart, pragmatic guy in this field. But I've been running a company for the last 7 years, and I totally get, like, sometimes you just need it, you just want it, you just got to have it, and it can't be my problem. It's got to be your problem, right? And so what I've done in the past in those situations, and I try to be pragmatic and allow my people to do this too, but it's like if the company has, and I'm going to say this just as direct as I can, if the company has kind of like an irrational set of expectations, you have $100,000 to go hire 15 people and to get this done by the end of July, right? And you're just looking at the body of work and you're just like, no way, right? Now, again, right, this is going to come down to, you take this advice carefully, right? Because it comes down to, I've politically killed myself in companies doing this, right? Because a lot of companies, again, it is way safer to say yes and to fail than it is to say no and to be right. Okay? Because the person who says yes and fails, they tried their hardest, right? The person who says no, but this is what we can legitimately do, puts themselves at risk because they're not a team player, right? So this is the reason why I don't work in companies anymore. Just want you to know that, right? So, yeah. So take this advice at your own risk, right? Take this advice at your own risk. What I would do is I would look at it and I would go, okay, if that's what you're telling me I have to do, that's what I have to do. Okay? And then I'd go and I'd unpack the scope, and I'd unpack my resources, and I'd unpack this, and I'd unpack that, and I'd put together a plan that had 2 or 3 options. Look, I've done this plan. This is not achievable within the time and cost that you want, right? So can we add more people? Well, no, we only have 6 COBOL developers. Okay. Can we assume we're going to work them 175% for the next month and a half? Well, no, we'd like them to not quit. Okay, cool. Can we take some scope out? Right? Can we do this? Can we do that? Right? Well, if the answer is no, you just kind of sit there and go, okay, well, we'll do the best I can, and I'll give you a status report every week and let you know how we're doing. Do my best to pull or crash the schedule or whatever. But all the data that I've presented to you indicates that you're not going to get this on time. But we'll do our best if that's what you want from me. Right? To me, I find, so this is my take, right, is I find that most senior leaders will not make irrational decisions faced with good data. What they do is they tend to make irrational decisions when they don't have good data and they don't believe you or trust you, and they're just saying, dude, just get it done because I got to have it, right? So I tend to, and again, it hasn't always been great for my career, but I tend to operate with the data is the data is the data is the data. And I'm going to put it in front of you, and I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'm going to let the person empowered to make business decisions make business decisions. And then it gets into kind of that code of ethics at the beginning of the PMBOK, right, that says it's our job as project managers. We have an ethical obligation to operate in this way with our stakeholders. Okay, right? I'm willing to take my chances. But I don't want to advise you to take your chances. You got to decide that. Well, yeah, right? Yeah, absolutely, right? I think you can get into a situation where you're kind of selling your soul, right? And at some point in time, right, you get into one of those and you go, okay, tough situation, right? Hopefully you survive it. If it starts killing your career, you're constantly in that situation, well, you just got to reevaluate if that's where you want to be, you know? Yeah. So like what I always tell people is like I've sat in front of many a client. I go, look, I'm not in the impossible scenario business, right? So what do I do when I have fixed time, fixed costs, fixed scope, irrational this, agile waterfall, nobody will make a decision, and I'm just the guy that has to figure it out? Put the data together, let them decide what the trade-offs are. Yeah. And I mean, I think you can do that with integrity, and I think if, you know, a lot of times that doesn't always work out negatively I had probably other issues in corporate America that were bigger than that, so. I'm a way better entrepreneur than I am an employee, I'll tell you.
We could all take a lesson from you, Mike, and start our own companies.
Well, you know, that comes with its own set of challenges, so be careful with that one too, but yeah, we're hanging in there so far, so. What is that?
It's a different form.
It's a different forum, yeah, yeah. So last week there's an Agile coaching group here in town that just formed up, and it's kind of invite only. And I did the talk last week on the business of Agile coaching, and so I talked a little bit about how we started up and how we formed, and how we do things. And it's very similar to managing a project, in a lot of ways. You're mitigating risk and assumptions and things like that, and trying to deal with uncertainty and variability, just like do. So my project management skills really helped with that. So. We're still in business, so fingers crossed. Any other thoughts, questions? One last? No good? Okay, excellent, guys. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.